Rise up, the Dukes are back, and now it's time to rise up. The crew is back, and now it's time to rise up. The Dukes are back, and now it's time to rise up. Rise up, rise up. The Dukes are back, and now it's time to rise up. The crew is back, and now it's time to rise up. The Dukes are back, and now it's time to rise up. Rise up.
And we're back to the D's on Fire podcast. As you can see, the technical difficulties are now live, and for Alec. So we'll time travel because I want to intro Zach Weiss's interview to the preview the game and the conference schedule. So we'll take you live to our interview with Zach Weiss right now. All right, and we're joined with special guest Zach Weiss, reporter for Pittsburgh Sports Now, has been covering Duquesne in some capacity or another for the heck since Alec and I were in school, which was many years ago. It's been what, seventh season, eighth season?
Eighth in full, I think 10th or 11th overall.
Jeez. So, Zach, you've been feeding the very much deprived Duquesne fans of all sports news for a while now. It seems like there's more media presence this year in the post-game pressers than usual. Has it been a little more crowded covering Duquesne sports, I guess basketball in particular?
I mean, yes and no. I think any time that experience of success, especially at the basketball level, which I think is what the Atlantic 10 is predominant, I think you're bound to see that. Unfortunately, the same cannot be said for the women's side. The student news, it depends really on if school's in and when the game is versus when they're. For basketball, you routinely have someone from the Tribune Review there. You have student there. You occasionally have the Post-Gazette started bringing somebody. Obviously, there's been some news has, of course, been that there's been a strike ongoing with the Post-Gazette and a lot of its writers. So it's been difficult staffing games from their perspective. But that being said, obviously I took a little bit of a break there. So I think a couple people were disappointed that were being asked to the players. But I guess that's the only purpose I serve. So I'll take the shove it. But regardless of that, in all seriousness, though, it's been it's an interesting experience covering all of the sports, and it's good to see this men's team, or the House of Horrors that a lot of last year represented, and it's good to see kind of by and large being a healthier unit, and you see that they figured out an identity. It just shows in the win-loss record that it replicates just that this is the standard, that the standard is back. So a couple overarching points there, but it's nice to have some media, but of course, the universe thing is too much. And I think, you're playing the game with everything else, but I think that it's impossible not to pay attention to what Duquesne's been able to do on both sides of the basketball.
All right, Alec, you want to take the next question?
Sure. So hey, Zach. Nice
Hey, Alec.
to meet you.
You too.
But yeah, my first question for you is this piece about Duquesne, kind of the recap of the Winthrop game and talk this team. And that's something me and Frost have talked about, like the team, everyone kind of getting involved. That's when we're playing at our best. So I'm curious, do you think the injury, we've also had a lot of injuries with this team, especially at the guard position recently. So injuries have helped or hurt this connectivity, because it kind of gives guys an opportunity to step up. Dixon early in the season, McGriff. Just kind of wanted to see what your opinion was for that.
You could go either way with that, Alec. I mean, you could say glass half full. These guys have been very through the duration of this 13-game non-conference schedule, and they've found a way. But look at it the other way from a conference standpoint. A lot of these guys are starting to get back into health, to be back maybe by the Rhode Island game, quite possibly, maybe against in the Dayton. It could be beyond that. Injuries during breaks can always change with prognostications that have played a lot of minutes, and eventually, when everybody comes back to health, there's a rotation in place, and there's going to be a lot of guys that are going to be unhappy with their minutes. Of a cohesion as you build, there also comes the line, am I going to be in the rotation? How do I make sure that I'm a team player? How, if you're a coaching staff member, do I keep all been integral in different ways and different capacities at different levels? How do I keep happy? So I think Keith is kind of playing both sides of the fence right now, where he's just glad this together. And yeah, have they done it predominantly at home? They absolutely have. Have they been 4 games in 10 days with one in Akron was maybe a bit much, and I think he would even admit 2-game losing streak. This team, despite all of the circumstances, really didn't flinch. So that's really what you build the summer for, to find that cohesion, find what makes each other tick, and then the non-con court, seeing what the strengths are, seeing what needs to be worked on. And as Keith said himself, after the important stretch was this maybe week 10 days in between games where he wants to figure out the rotation to back health, give guys a chance to rest, recover their bodies, enjoy their families, hopefully not fly back, still be stranded, and otherwise just try to figure everything else out.
Yeah, and I did
Southwest
see
stuff. I mean,
Yeah.
67% or something. I read people are is crazy.
Yes.
I did see about half the team walking on campus as my kids and wife and I were going to the Harlem Globetrotters game last night. So can confirm that a decent amount of them are there.
That means they're safe.
Yeah. Zach, my next question for you is for both teams. Do you see any similarities or what's the big differences between this year's teams for the men's and women's side versus the past 2 years?
Sure. The women have been healthier and the women have been on. I mean, you and I have had private conversations on Instagram, Slick Nick after game, and a lot of it was actually captured probably by that when where both teams kind of had very much copy paste efforts, where it almost was a joke, but you could have written the quick gamer and just copy pasted and changed the names around and maybe a score here and there. It's carbon copy. I mean, I think both teams are sharing the ball well. They feel really comfortable where they're at. They've been challenged in a variety of different ways. I think the miscues have kind of been to losing their way, maybe more offensively, although the men have had some defensive issues. More consistent on the defensive end than the men have been. That being said, though, I think selection was kind of a big reason for a lot of those losses between the two teams. But you pieces, I think the men's rotation is maybe a little bit deeper right now than the women's is, although I think to get more players those reps in practice to give them the opportunities to find their especially an A-10 where you might need that next person down the line, whereas with Duquesne men, it's going to be having to make some very tough decisions where maybe a player here, a player there, have none, might have some, might only come in if there's foul trouble. So really, I think good reasons to be happy. They're competitive on the boards. They're on the ball for loose balls. The guys, I think, had one slip up when the body language was a little bit bad between those two losses. When you're losing and you coach, you build for so much, and the coaches are telling you something maybe in the moment. And it's really difficult because when you lose the body language, you almost lose the game. You don't want to let your blood because that only gives them further proof. Whereas I think the women, when you talk about the city game, just didn't make. They plain and simple didn't make. I really think that the most dominant player of the game was on the other side of really imposed their will when Duquesne had a clear post advantage. And sometimes losses can be learned. The women really did a good job of where did we go wrong in this game and how can we, each time they figured out those mistakes, they built on those and they made progress. I mean, defensively, their pack line is a lot more consistent than what they've had in recent. With the guys, I think the injuries, it's kind of the Clint Hurdle effect. If you now what? I mean, when Kareem goes down, and obviously you have Tevin go down, those that really pass the ball well and are vocal in their own different ways, especially Kareem with his vocality. Replace a guy that's had 6 turnovers in 188 minutes. I mean, that's really hard to push to shove. But I think the guys are finding themselves. You've had guys and versatility playing a point and then being able to play a post depending on what the circumstances. With the women, I think there's that belief, and I think that belief was a little bit more subtle at each game. You're seeing it a little bit more on the court, that I think both teams now head into it and they come into that gym with the expectation to win. They're not hunting for a win. They're seeking respect. And I think that attitude to change is warranted, and it's only going here.
So Zach, my next question is about the men and kind of, as we go into conference play, just we were projected to be last in the A-10 preseason. Now we're play. What do you think the A-10 looks like for the Dukes?
I think preseason polls are a worthless piece of junk that the players can really a motivational tool. And I say that as one of the people that get a vote in that preseason poll. How it works is, at least preseason, each coach gets a vote and one media member for each fluent member to vote. And Saba makes the dumb mistake of letting me be the vote. No, he lets me. Dave's let me vote the last few years, and on record, I put the Dukes 10th. It was one of those. I certainly did not put them last, but basically, when you look at it on what happened the year before preseason, you really can't gauge. Especially, there's always at least one or two. Transfer portal has become such a free for all that it's impossible to say, okay, well, this player going to do in the Atlantic 10. This guy was an ACC player. Now, how is he going to do in the Atlantic 10? This guy, you get the idea. So it's really, really tough to gauge. So a lot of it's just pure guesswork. But of course, Keith is going to say UMFers were picked up and last, to that effect. I mean, they're going to say something like that. I'm keeping it clean for the podcast, but that's going to take that and they're going to run with that. That's all Keith has to do is say it once, maybe twice, and then off to the races. You keep that belief and you hold that chip. And this team has always been a team, even batting days with Kavian, Dunmar, Mike Hughes, Marcus Weathers, Sincere Carey. These guys have to be told much. They understood, and they've always been guys that Keith's always recruited, the under the radar guy, the one that's carried the proverbial chip on his shoulder. And this team does a good job of that, but it's different. They're doing it in rhythm. There's a clear liking to each other. There's not as much worry what's going to be mine. I mean, in the beginning of the season, Trey Williams was a guy that was, playing 30 plus minutes out of necessity every single game. And you see the box score the first game and you see what? Oh, geez, something must be wrong with Trey. No, nothing was wrong with Trey. What was happening was that rotating in and out post guys and giving guys a blow. And it was smart, and it might be something you see more maybe down the line, like an RJ Gunn comes in, or as Chabi comes back and gets conditioning, and maybe that makes a little bit less fouling, which was something that was more prevalent. Something like that come back, or maybe a guy like Trey doesn't have to burn all those minutes. That way he's fresh. Especially a guy like Trey who was injured last year and missed the rest extended the end of the season when, of course, you want him back the most. So really what it is now is just on a trajectory where there's a clear determination. I think Dayton and B road is a very, very good first game for them. They need to be on the road right now. They've been home out of their own bubbles. It forces them in a season that's been chock full of adversity on a result, and I think they expect to win. I mean, Keith from the jump, his first couple years that Dayton said about the Flyers, hey, these guys, our team's just the guys that Dayton didn't want. I mean, if you have that mentality, and a lot of these guys, of course, being Ohio guys, and they very heavily, of course, you're having the battles with Dayton on a daily basis. And so this game, in a sense, becomes personal. It's almost like a city game in that respect, because for this staff, the city game, and you always have some semblance of Ohio on the roster. Of course, Day Grant from Lorain, Ohio, so you have that Ohio there as well. So
Yeah.
really, push comes to shove. I mean, I think this is if it goes your way. I think it provides a lot of belief, especially if you go back to that poll that you mentioned at the quote. Dayton was picked number one, and it doesn't get any better than beating the proverbial number one. But if it does go the opposite way, then the test becomes we've believed our hype for so long. We make sure that one doesn't become two, that two doesn't become three, like it did last year.
Right.
Where one and all of this was nothing. And Slick Nick, it goes back to something we discussed in men's soccer, where they've accomplished everything, but they've accomplished nothing at the same time. To themselves in conference when it matters the most. And it's great what Ken Pump, it's great what Joe Lenardi projects, it's great what XYZ projects. Now you have to do it. And this team has plenty of motivation and plenty of firepower and plenty of belief in doing it. Now it's down to executing.
Man, you touched on a lot of things that I've loved so far about this season. They picked us last rallying cry from Joe Reese's first post-game press conference. Seems like the rallying cry of the team the entire way. The Dayton rivalry, which it's bizarre this year that they're not playing two games in the conference. It seems like that's always been a two-game schedule for Duquesne. And it does feel like that's kind of like Duquesne's biggest rival, although I know Dayton probably doesn't look at us as their biggest rival by any means. And then Bonaventure's like the other team. And it's based mainly off proximity. I think that those two teams are like the ones that Duquesne fights with the most, especially Bonaventure when the games have gotten a little dicey over the past few years. But with all that said, what are your thoughts on this Dayton game that's coming up? Do you think the Dukes match up well against them this year?
I mean, Dayton's a product in a lot of sense. They, during non-conference, really had to battle health. A lot of what you saw on that 8-5 record is them battling health. A lot of this graduating from year one into year two, especially youth that is now their core. Full of all conference defenders on that team that are extremely talented, but it's on Duquesne to, of course, understand what the scout is, and because you're on the road, there's less of a margin for error there, and so it's knowing the scout, but also knowing and having that greater sense of self. Whatever is on the court in terms of body, this is what it is. Whether it's coach's preference, somebody that practiced well and riding the hot, just flat out someone's injured and they're just not good enough to go. Those 50-50 injuries time of year, this is when you go. This is when you play, and this is when you learn. Maybe you're on a minutes, but I mean, we've seen Duquesne go up against the when Dayton during their and they only had one loss to their name, and they were leading at UD Arena in that first half. I was at, and they were taking it to them, and something flipped. So it's on them to put in a complete 40 in an environment that's one of the best in the Atlantic 10 year in and year out, regardless of state. UD Arena, the people are very, very nice, but that place is very tough to play. I remember that game very early undefeated season. They put me right in front of the student section that year, and I should have worn a poncho because I had so much spit on my shirt from all the fans being so spirited that it was. But it's always a fantastic place to play. The fans always bring it. You know that wants to protect the home court, especially a court like that, which consistently hosts the first four ever. So you know that it's a basketball mecca in its own respect, and Duquesne wants to start off the season right, and they have the tools to do so. They just have to knock some shots down, play some solid. He's not going to give them anything. They're very disciplined, and they don't make the unforced errors, especially at home. So playing within yourself, it's pushing the pace, it's finding counters, because as coach speak as it is, you know that Dayton success and makes some run, but it's going to come down to, especially early in the season, this last who's going to flinch the least, who's going to make the least mistakes, and who's further along as a basketball team. And I really think that Duquesne has a shot, but of course Dayton's always court so well, it's always going to be a tough matchup. But I think if anything, Duquesne's shown this year, it's by no means.
You said something interesting earlier, and it was something that last podcast I was kind of worried about, which was we had a 9-game homestand. at Cooper House Arena. So you kind of spun it in a way where you like that the first road game is a big team like Dayton, as opposed to maybe a LaSalle, where if we went to LaSalle as the first A-10 game, and you might be sleeping on a game away for the Dukes.
I mean, I personally think, this schedule of Keith's first schedule, his first season, where they just played home every single chance. And I think what Keith was trying to do was instill confidence in this team. Of course, anytime it's available, you take that matchup and you run with it. And I think he did that. And I think say that personally, I just wanted to see where my team was at. I want to see where we stack up against tradition, set up, and how we can shape the team from then on and realize what our weaknesses are. But I'm after others, does he play the game in Akron? I don't know, because I think he said after one of the pressers, look, we always get some kind of injury or something kind of happens. We win the game, but somehow we get some kind of injury. I think that playing so much at home, it builds habits, but there's the minus side. You're not as battle tested. Having that adversity of traveling, of not sleeping in your own dorm, of being on the road, of being in a hostile environment. There's kind of yin and yang to that effect. So having it where it is that much in your face at Dayton, it's going to be a near capacity crowd. It's going to be one of the biggest crowds Duquesne sees the entire year. Having that in your face and having that adversity right away, that's what you live for, right? That's what you embrace. And for it to be there, and then you have a couple days in between before you come back for a brief little homestand. I think this sets up really well. Duquesne, win or loss, I think it's going to be a really good, rewarding experience for them. And I think the players they're kind of pent up, frustrated. When a lot of these young, unproven players, they want to go, they want to be away, and when the doctor's away, see what happens. And they certainly have the ability to do so. And I would put Dayton and VCU right up there as two of the most raucous environments. And that VCU is going to bring fans on the 4th, so you already know that that's going to be a good little 50-50 game, if not more. So really, it's going to be a nice little test being there, and then having Archie Miller right there in the middle, regardless of how his teams do. It's still Archie, they're going to come and bring their best. So it's a good little set. As cliche as it is, there's not many nights off in the Atlantic 10. I think that Duquesne used to be a night off, but not really, other than last year, has that been the case. So there's certainly a really, really good potential to start off the season with the conference season, or as Dan Burt would like to call it, a second season, the right way. And the men certainly have the ability to doing that. I think the women have a little bit of a tougher task. Admittedly, Rhode Island is tough, but they've got a health challenge right now with Dolly Cairns on their end that they're going to have to see if they're going to play with her on Saturday. But I think the men have a really, really good shot. They just have to believe in it and just find ways to find success away from home. And again, the belief is certainly there. The result just has to be.
You touched on earlier that the preseason polls are kind of just, he can throw them out.
Hogwash.
If now that we're kind of at the end of the first season, as Coach Burt would put it, how do you think these two teams would match up if there was a new poll done of the coaches and the media? Where do you think the Dukes would rank in both polls?
Well, I think men's wise, I think a lot of people are going to look, just basically go, oh, overall record, we're going to base it on that. Let's face it, Fordham's not the best men's basketball team in the conference. I love you, Fordham. I like the change you made going with the assistant coach with Ergo as the coach, but not all 12-1s are created equal, right? That being said, it is impressive that they already have as many wins as before last season they had probably for the last 3 or 4 years prior. But that being said, UMass has to be up there too. What Frank Martin's done to change that culture, and with him still not being satisfied, Heath still is not satisfied. He says they're probably about 50-60% of where they should be. I'd still put Dayton and St. Louis up top. You kind of have to. I'd probably put UMass and I'd probably put UMass and VCU right there, and then you probably put Duquesne right there. So probably in that 4 or 5 line right now is where I would have Duquesne on the men's side. And frankly, I think on the women's side, you're probably looking at, I would say 5th, 6th, kind of in a similar setting. I think that just, UMass has been the gold standard. Rhode Island's been good. Joe's is impressed. It's kind of beyond that. You're kind of going apples and oranges. Do you put a LaSalle? Do you put a Duquesne? Do you put a Richmond? Maybe even Mason's kind of been up and down, but they've kind of impressed. So I mean, I'd put Duquesne probably fifth on the men's, fifth, sixth on the women. So kind of again, very similar. I think that the women's is going to be a little bit more concrete than the men's is right now. Of course, that could change. You always have to see how it goes. But I mean, even as much as it is, I mean, I never had Duquesne DFL dead freaking last or anything like that. But I mean, I had them 10th or 11th, so I've almost gone up spots right there as it is. So it's a testament to the belief that they have. They still, I think, need to find more counters for when Day Grant is contained. I think that's something that's really, and Day is going to take his his heat check shots, and sometimes they'll go in, sometimes they're not. It's all about, if those don't go in, finding defenses or on the bench because of foul trouble. How do you come to the test, and how do you find counters to that? And I think that's still a work in progress. I think the men have the opportunity. The women, I think, stay healthy. Obviously, I'm sure the women's fans were held with bated breath when Meg McConnell kind of took that hit on the far side of the courtside seating. But by all accounts, she appears to be okay. And so is Tess Myers, leading the nation in threes. So obviously that's very accomplished. I've seen the work that she puts in before games. She really has worked on her shot and keep time that, shooters shoot. And the Duquesne women's staff has consistently encouraged Tess to shoot, and everything's evened out and she's finding success again. And of course, I think Amaya and Hamilton and Precious Johnson have really kind of found their confidence. And I think they feel a lot less pressure with Yanni Townsend there. And I think that really is helping free their games up. And I think Yanni's also kind of coming back to full health. I don't think she's at 100%, but she's enough where even her post presence and her ability to grab rebounds is still a difference maker. Meg McConnell's Meg McConnell. I think I got to send Dan Bird a shirt. I think I found about messing around and getting a triple double or something like that. But Meg always brings it and does so with a smile on her face. I mean, Nail Bernard's kind of found comfort in her game and realizing what she does well and executing it the best possible way. And Lauren Wasselson's a player that really is starting to get back to health. I mean, heaven forbid. I mean, at times she probably felt like she was a game of operation, but she's really put it together to where she can become somebody that you can count on in the rotation that can provide a good 15, maybe 20 minutes a game if push comes to shove. And for her, I think that's really important. And she feels welcome. I think she said in an article that she kind of felt like she didn't make the right choice necessarily going to Xavier. And I think that now being back home and being maybe a little bit more mature throughout her college time, I think has helped her. And I think that this is just the right fit at the right time. So again, if you have people like Liv Westfall or Riley Sun position, Anaya Walker, Singo, those ladies kind of trying to get those reps in practice and maybe pick up some things, I think that they can become part of the rotation, because you don't necessarily want to have 7. You'd almost want to rather have 8 or 9, especially down the stretch, because look, things happen. It's very physical in any conference play, and you want to make sure that you have the best semblance of self just in case God forbid something happens. So I think both teams are on a very, very good trajectory. I think they're on very similar trajectories, as we all hit kind of upon earlier. And now it just comes down to finding execution.
So based off of those rankings, you think NIT might be the thing that they're obviously striving for bigger, but those might be what fans' expectations can kind of look at right now?
It depends on how the conference does. I mean, non-conference, kind of the two standard bearers of your conference being 8-5, I don't think necessarily help. As coaches, you root in non-conference for your conference teams. You want the conference to be as strong as possible. That way, in March, when the NCAA calls for the tournament, you want to have more than one team. And the Atlantic 10 is typically a league that has 3 teams in it. And I don't know if you get 2 this year. And if that happens, that's 1 or 2 less spots you have in an NIT. And I know in the pandemic year when Duquesne was probably in their peak under Keith, I think that I did ask him, if the NIT called, would you listen? Because other tournaments, if you remember, I believe in the last year in Ferry, they played in the CBI or something similar to that. And Danbrot said no, they wouldn't play CBI or anything like that, but they would take the call from the NIT. And I think that's a realistic expectation. I mean, obviously you strive for more. You want the NCAA tournament. You want to bring history back onto the bluff. But Would they answer if the NIT was on the other line? Yeah, I think they would, and I think they would be competitive because it's kind of been, that different guy every night. Of course, Day has been getting his points, but there's been unheralded performances on a game by game basis, and there's enough variety there that I think they would be able to find success. The women's team, I mean, UMass and to an extension, Rhode Island and so on and so forth those are tough nuts to crack. But I mean, mind you, you do have UMass at home. It is weird seeing Dayton kind of towards the bottom of the league. It's weird seeing VCU at the very bottom of the league, although they had that a few years ago before they won on their 3-4 year run that they just had. So this could just be Beth O'Boyle building towards a rebuilding year, realizing what she has, trying to find what strengths to play offensively and defensively most resemble her team, and then now this time of year fine-tuning that and maybe finding some success this year but more next year. So it'll be interesting to see where these teams are at. The potential is certainly there, and both teams obviously know the A-10 venues very well. Of course, the men are at Barclays and the women are in Wilmington, Delaware for A-10. So it'll be interesting to see how much everything shakes out, but there's still a lot to decide these next 2+ months here.
Alec, any other questions from you?
No, you went into great detail with that everything. Appreciate your time. But yeah, that's it on my end. You good for us?
Yeah. I mean, I talk with Zach on the regular through Instagram, so
Yeah.
we're in each other's DMs talking about stuff too. And you mentioned RJ Gunn possibly working minutes in. One of the topics we do talk about is the kind of handling of the bigs on the guy side of things, because that's so tough to really evaluate what the ideal minutes would be. Do you think the coaching staff has a plan as to what they want the ideal rotation to be, or do you think it's kind of just seeing who has the hot hands, so to speak?
Well, I think hot hands certainly plays a factor. Keith obviously knows RJ from before. He spoke very highly of him last year. He spoke highly of him going into this year. He reminds me a little bit of him and Joe Reese have that veteran experience where they can stretch. I think, if you can play these guys in tandem, keep Rotroff's minutes down, keep Trey Williams's minutes down, be able to kind of use Joe Reese as just a disruptor where he's kind of multifaceted. I think if you can spread these guys out, and then you have to balance David Dixon in there too. I mean, I think Kevin Easley's departure does help in that. I think it was best in the interest of both sides that he move on. Obviously, anytime you get suspended for 7 games, that's very, very difficult. I think maybe without surmising too much, I think he was expecting more. I think, anytime you leave a program, you were one of the leaders on a program last year, you expect to come back and find some success, but the standard last year is not at all what the standard is this year. And you don't have players necessarily just trying to go through the motions. You have players that are their motions now are to win basketball games, and there's a clear expectation of that. And I think when you get feedback from the next level and you come back and you change your body a little bit, you change your shot a little bit, you're expecting more, and maybe those expectations weren't what you expected on the other end. It's difficult to manage when a lot of other guys are passing you, and he's graduated, and congratulations to him on that. And whatever he does next, I know he's going to find a lot of success. He seems like all the conversations post game seem like a very thoughtful and intelligent guy, and I think that he'll find success in whatever he does next. Unfortunately for him, and unfortunately for Duquesne, it's not for the Dukes. But I think the Dukes have almost an embarrassment of riches at that position right now, and it's going to be going back to an earlier answer where a lot of guys are going to try to look for their minutes, and you don't want to lose anybody to transfer. You just don't. And I do give Keith credit for not going the Mohima route with David Dixon and giving him opportunities to fail and giving him opportunities to learn. I think he needs to be a little bit more sure of himself, especially not just with his decision making, but on catches. He's kind of still popcorning the ball around a little bit. And this is the time of year where perhaps David Dixon and what Keith does might actually be one of the more important decisions, where do you continue to let him build, or now that it's go time, is it what you did in the past where you make one mistake, maybe you sit. If you make 2 mistakes, you're definitely sitting, especially when the post play is that competitive and you can't take nights off. It's going to be really interesting to see how he handles David Dixon now, where before those mistakes were acceptable, now maybe less so. So obviously you have a guy like RJ Gunn who's shooting around. I don't know what his ability is in a practice setting, but if he does practice, then obviously that means that he's closer to returning. That, I mean, 1-1 is 2 here. So it'll be interesting to see who plays for how much in this Dayton game and how much of a baseline Keith uses pending how this team plays. I mean, if this team happens to have a flat performance at Dayton, I mean, everything's an if and then what. But if they're flat against Dayton, does he change things? How much of a reaction is an overreaction or an overcorrection? And is it an overcorrection if they find a way to beat Rhode Island? Is Rhode Island up to the standard that Dayton is, and this, that, and the other? I mean, there's a lot of things to factor, and that's above all 3 of our pay grades, and thank goodness for that. But I mean, there's a lot for the staff to consider, and when and if RJ Gunn comes back, that's only going to excitingly complicate things, where that is just one more decision that this team has to make. I think that if Gunn is out, I think that gives Dixon more opportunities. It would only make more sense to let him have, I don't know, at least a 10-minute opportunity, whereas maybe you see other guys putting in 15, 20, 25, 30-minute opportunities pending fouls in the scope of the game. I mean, you let Dixon go, do you kind of let Xavi go a little bit and kind of let him work some of this rest off and just get some more game reps because he is the true center that this team doesn't have, and let him bang bodies down low and give some guys a breather, or maybe give a foul so that somebody doesn't necessarily have to burn something on the other end or burn some physicality. So there's a lot of tough decisions, and we're still not even out of 2022 yet. So there's still a lot of time and a lot of factors to be had. And I mean, that's what it's about. I mean, it's frankly about peaking at the right time. And if they can play similar to how they played in the first half of that Winthrop game, then this team's on a positive trajectory. But if they revert back to the second half behaviors, then there's maybe a little bit more work on this than we thought that there was.
Good problems to have.
Yes.
All right, Zach. Well, because we're running short on time, I just want to thank you again for stopping in and talking with us. And as I told Coach Burt, you're always welcome to give your thoughts on the Dukes. Much better insight than the 2 of us have just watching from our houses. Yeah.
Well, definitely come to a game. I mean, obviously, it's about as exciting of a time as it is, and I'm sure Dan would, of course, light up if he saw you, Slick Nick. And I mean, I'm sorry that I'm not on the caliber of Dan, but I mean, who is? I guess after midnight, I'm the default Duquesne guy, but before midnight, Dan Burr can be the guest. That's fine, whatever.
That's right. All right, Zach.
Thanks a lot,
so
Zach.
No problem, guys. You got it.
Hello, Archer making his podcast debut here. Thank you, Zach Weiss, for always being willing to come on and giving us a breakdown of the conference expectations and the Dayton game, which has already happened. Alec and I talked at length about the Dayton game immediately following, and there were audio issues that did not allow you to hear Alec's thoughts. So we're going to re-record sometime in the next few days, going over Dayton and Rhode Island games. And you'll be getting an extra pod out of it. So thank you for listening to us, and go Dukes.
Back and now it's time to rise up, rise up.